Last week we read from the book of Genesis. We read chapters 2 and 3, and today our text is from Genesis 15. Now, in the great scheme of the Bible, not reading 12 chapters doesn't seem like such a large jump. However, we're missing several important stories, including Cain killing Abel, some of the first children of Adam and Eve, Noah, the ark and the flood, and the Tower of Babel. We are also missing an important chapter from our reading today, chapter 12. Because in this chapter, chapter 12, we hear the original blessing, the calling of Abram by God. It's here that we hear God say, "Leave your land, your family, your father's household, for the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation and bless you and make your name respected, and you will be a blessing." Abram hears this promise, this blessing, as vague as it is, and follows God. Abram leaves his home, his family and friends, and he enters a land he doesn't know. Now, while chapter 12 doesn't tell us how Abram interprets this blessing, we know from our reading today in Genesis 15 that Abram is expecting that he will have biological children, especially a son, that will carry on his legacy and inherit his land and his wealth. Yet we know from the promise in chapter 12 that while God says that Abram will be a great nation, God doesn't explicitly say that Abram will have children. In fact, the promise is so vague that the readers, nor Abram really, have any idea how God intends to fulfill it. But this doesn't stop Abram from believing that he will become a great nation by having more children. And we are much like Abram. There are moments in our lives when we think we know what other people are saying, when we assume we know what someone means, and we set our expectations on how things will play out on these assumptions. Now, perhaps this happens when we are not fully listening to someone else, or as our understanding of a word or phrase just means something completely different to someone else. Now, this can be as simple as telling your children, "Give me a minute." We actually don't mean just give us 1 minute, but our children think that. Or maybe you have traveled overseas and know that you should not ask for a napkin at dinner in England because a napkin in England is a diaper. Now, this is also true in our spiritual lives. Just like Abram's blessing in chapter 12, God gives us promises as well. He promises us an abundant life and wholeness. She promises us life and light in the midst of darkness. And we are promised justice. And much like the original blessing of Abram, there are few details in these promises of God. What does it mean to have an abundant life, or wholeness, or find life, or even justice? And yet we often assume that what God means by an abundant life and wholeness is happiness, a life with few difficulties, or even abundance of material wealth. And we expect to receive justice in our lifetimes. But is this what God means? Or are we filling in the holes with the specifics that we want? Abram tries to fill in the details of a very vague blessing, just as we tend to do. I want to invite you to take a moment to reflect and try to recall a time when you assumed something that wasn't actually said. Abram hears the call from God in chapter 12. He leaves everything and everyone he knows behind. While Abram believes that to become a great nation, he must first have a biological son, we know from the text that almost a decade later, Abram still has no child. I can only imagine that this reality begins to cause doubt and fear in Abram. Perhaps he begins to ask himself, did I make the right choice to leave home and follow this God? Did God ever intend to fulfill the promise? Will I ever have children? Or will I be forgotten and my family line end with me? 10 years is a long time to wait, especially if you're expecting a child. And Abram was 75 years old when he first heard God's call and blessing, so he didn't have much time to waste. And after all these years of waiting for the first signs that the promise was coming true, was finally taking a toll on Abram. So when God appears in chapter 15 saying, "Don't be afraid, I'm your protector," Abraham doesn't respond so well. He says, "What can you possibly give me, God, since I still have no children? My head of household is my only heir." In a couple of chapters, we'll learn that arguing or questioning God isn't out of character for Abram. God doesn't get mad, though, or even frustrated with Abram's question. Instead, God fully listens to what Abram is feeling and responds to what Abram needs, some reassurance that yes, the promise will come true. Out of love for Abram, God offers this reassurance. God says, your head of household will not be your heir. You will have a biological son. And then God took Abram outside and said, look at the sky and count the stars if you can. This is how many children you will have. Now, if we read further on in the chapter, we would learn that God takes it a step further by solidifying God's promise with a covenant. We all need reassurance that God's promises are true. But I want to invite you to pause for just a moment and reflect on this question. What do you need to hear in order to trust in the promises of God? We all need reassurance at times that God's promises are true. In these days of the pandemic, it's truly difficult sometimes to see how isolation, limited movement, and the death of over 200,000 people can bring about abundant life. How does being separated from our community bring wholeness? How is the death of so many life-giving? And in the time of social unrest, when we are confronted with systematic racism and racial inequality in our country that has been perpetuated for decades, how can we believe that justice will come in our lifetime? We can't. Not without reassurance, not without evidence. As pastors, we are acutely aware of this need. Much of the work of being a pastor is trusting that what you are doing is meaningful for your community. This is because most of the time, pastors are not privy to the connection between what we are doing and the changes people are experiencing. It's one of the reasons I keep a love file with notes and thank yous from members over the years that offer me bits of reassurance that the work I do is meaningful. Yet I've found in this pandemic, there are a few more notes, a few more thank yous, a few more glimpses into changes people are experiencing. Some of the things that have reassured me these last few months have been conversations with new people. Yes, new people are still connecting with our church, despite us not meeting in person. I have also received a note from someone that told me how radically different their life has changed because of our worship together. And I'm inspired by our members who continue to call each other, check in with one another through difficult times. And I am so thankful that members let me know about situations that need my attention. And I'm inspired by those who ask questions, wrestle with racial inequality and racism in our system, and the work they do to transform themselves through our studies together. I'm inspired by those who pick up groceries for their neighbors, who drive each other to doctor's appointments, and those who work with the most vulnerable among us, and those who are dreaming of new ministries so that we can continue to care for our neighbors. To me, all of these things are signs of an abundant life, of a wholeness found in our community. These are signs that we are doing the work of the church, even while we are not meeting in person. Seeing all of these things is my reassurance that the promises of God are real and are still unfolding, that abundant life and wholeness is not about happiness, and it's not about gathering on Sunday morning, but rather serving one another and being transformed by the love of God. And while justice can seem elusive, the arc of justice is still moving forward as each of us is transformed and work to transform our world. When God loved Abram enough to reassure him and show him the stars, Abram had a choice to make. He could either trust God or go home. Abram chose to trust God, to have faith that the promise would come true. And in doing so, Abram chose life. We too must choose to believe that even in a pandemic, even in a time of such uncertainty, that God is reassuring us through this community and our neighbors that the promises of God will still come true, that we can still find wholeness, we can still have an abundant life, even while we are a bit separated from one another. I pray that God's love for you might reassure you and give you the courage to believe that the promise of an abundant life and wholeness is still possible. And may you, like Abram, choose life rather than going back. Amen.